Hey, what's up everybody? This is Jerry. Welcome back to our auto layout video tutorial series. In this part of the series, I'm going to talk about using auto layout in Interface Builder. Interface Builder has come a long way in its support for auto layout since it was introduced in iOS 6, and now has very solid tools for creating a layout and the corresponding constraints. Let's dive right in. The first thing to understand is that Interface Builder allows you to lay out views visually before defining any constraints at all. What you see is not necessarily what you get. In other words, while at runtime, the frame of a view will be determined only by its auto layout constraints, at design time, the frame on the screen might not match to what it will be when auto layout constraints are applied. This allows you to visually lay out your interface and then build up the system of constraints around that layout. If you don't fully define the constraints for your layout, Xcode will automatically add constraints at runtime to try to reproduce the layout that you created. You should not ship an app without fully defining the constraints though. The automatic constraints almost certainly won't react to changes the way you want, and Apple recommends fully defining your own constraints for your layout. When you're dragging views around in Interface Builder, the blue dotted line guides you see are not related to constraints. They're just helpful guides to indicate when views are a standard distance apart or when views are aligned with each other. Apple has guidelines for a minimum distance between views and spacing to the edge of the view, and these guides just help you see when a view is at that distance. You can use these guides to visually lay out your interface before defining any constraints. It's almost always easier to lay out views where they should be, and then define the constraints to match that layout. Once you start adding constraints, Interface Builder will draw orange or red line to indicate missing constraints, conflicting constraints, or a case where the frame of the view is different than what's defined by the constraints. If it isn't clear what the indicators are telling you, there's also a button in the document outline that you can click to view a detailed listing of the warnings and errors with your constraints. Now, don't get too concerned about these warnings at first. Just like when you're in the middle of typing code and the compiler may be warning you about an unused variable before you've written the code that uses it. Until you're done defining all your constraints, you will see some warnings. Remember, auto layout needs constraints to define the X and Y position, width and height of each view. So if you've just created the constraint for only the X position, it will warn you that it needs constraints for those other properties until you define them. Before you get started creating your first constraints, let's talk about some terminology. Let's take an example. Say you created a new view controller in Interface Builder and drag a child view out onto it, and now you want to start creating constraints on it. The first thing you might do is create a top space constraint. This is just a constraint that defines the distance between the top of the view and another view or its superview. Similarly, a bottom space constraint defines the distance between the bottom of the view and another view. Those are pretty straightforward. Next, you have a leading space constraint, and that usually defines the distance between the left side of the view and another view. Why is it called a leading space constraint? Well, auto layout has built-in support for languages that read right to left. In left to right languages, the leading space is the left edge, but in right to left languages, the leading space is the right edge. It's the edge that leads the reading direction. Then if your user is using your app in a right to left language, the constraints will automatically adjust the interface for that direction. You can create an explicit left space constraint, but usually you want to just create a leading space constraint to make supporting other languages easier. Similarly, you have a trailing edge constraint, and this is just the trailing edge of the reading direction. So in left to right languages, that will be the right edge, and in right to left languages, it'll be the left edge. Next, you have layout guides. Each controller has a top layout guide and a bottom layout guide. These guides are useful for views that have translucent or transparent status or navigation bar for the top guide, or tab bar or toolbar for the bottom guide. While the topmost view goes behind these see-through elements, you usually don't want to position your interface behind them, so you can create constraints relative to the guides, and it will handle automatically avoiding those elements. New in iOS 9, additional guides can be created in code to help with layout, but I'll get to that in a later tutorial. Finally, there's the concept of margins. Each view defines internal margins as a desired amount of space between the edge of the view and any subviews. When creating constraints between a subview and a superview, you can create the constraint to the view itself or to its margins. So that's the theory. Let's see about creating some constraints in practice. I'm going to create a new project in Xcode. And here just choose iOS application and a single view application and click Next. We'll call this Demo Auto Layout and create that on the desktop. In this demo, we'll be working exclusively in the storyboard. So let's make a little room for ourselves. We'll use Command 0 to hide that left pane and take a look at what the storyboard looks like. You'll notice that the view is not the size of an iPhone or an iPad. One of the things that auto layout is useful for is creating a layout that works on any size of a view, whether it's an iPhone 5 or a 6 or a 6 Plus or on an iPad. It's useful for all of those. And so Xcode helps you out here by creating a view that's a generic size. It's not the size of any of those. For more on size classes and creating layouts on those different screen sizes, remember you can always look at the adaptive layout video tutorial series. Before I start creating this layout, I want to describe it to you. As I mentioned, auto layout is a way for you to describe to the system how your layout will work, and so I'm going to describe it to you. We want two buttons that are going to be pinned to the bottom of the view in an equal space with a standard spacing between them. So let's start creating that. So when I drag this button out, Interface Builder starts showing me these blue dotted lines. Those dotted lines are not constraints. They're just guides that show you the standard spacing to the edge of the control or when you're aligned to something like the center of the view. And they're helpful for creating views in those locations, but they're not really constraints. So first I'm going to drag this button to the lower left-hand corner, and just to make it a little bit easier to see the button, we're going to change the text color to white and the background color to gray. And then we want another button just like that one, so we'll duplicate this using Command D. And we're going to drag it to the right-hand corner. You can see when I'm dragging this, it's showing me even more guides. It's showing me that the two buttons are aligned on their top and on their bottom, their center and their baseline of the text. And then it shows me when it's a standard distance from the right margin. Those are all just guides that help you drag those views into the position you want them. Then we'll define constraints to let the system know that's where we want them to be. So when I described this, I mentioned that I want these to be roughly equal. So we'll do that now. We're just going to kind of eyeball it, make these roughly equal in width and a standard space apart. Okay, we've laid out our interface visually, but we haven't created any constraints yet. But Interface Builder will automatically create constraints on them for you. But if you remember, those are not the constraints that we want to ship with, and let me show you why. I'm going to open up the Assistant Editor, and if you haven't used this before, there's a preview editor in the Assistant Editor that you can use to preview what your view will look like in different form factors and orientations. So we can see we have the iPhone 4-inch form factor here in the portrait orientation. And you can see our buttons sort of at the bottom, but they're, this one's running off the side and they're not exactly the way we would want them to look. That's because we haven't created any constraints yet. The constraints that Interface Builder created for us just pin these to a hard-coded X and Y position with the width and the height that we used at design time. And that's not really what we want. And if we look, we can look at other form factors as well. Let's use the 6 Plus form factor. And again, the constraints aren't really putting the buttons where we want them to be. They're not at the bottom of the view. That's where we want them to be. So let's start defining that now. We'll close the assistant editor. The first constraint that we're going to create is between the left button and its super view. So we'll control drag from the button and just drop anywhere on the view. The options that are shown in this menu that pops up when you control drag are filtered by the direction that you dragged. So in this case, I dragged from the button to the super view, and it's showing me leading space to the container margin. If you remember, the leading space is the left space in a left to right language, and the container margin is just the margin of the super view. If we had control dragged from the button in an upward direction, it would filter it to show me constraints that apply to the vertical direction, the vertical spacing to the top layout guide, for example. So the first constraint we want to create is that leading space constraint to the container margin, and we can just click to create that. When we create our first constraint, Interface Builder starts showing us these red lines. And this is what I was talking about before, where when you're in the middle of creating constraints, it'll show you some warnings and errors, but we're not really worried about those yet because we haven't finished creating the constraints for this view yet. Okay, next we're going to control drag from the button down and create a vertical space to the bottom layout guide. And remember, the bottom layout guide helps you to automatically avoid toolbar or tab bar. In this case, we don't have either one of those, so it's just creating it to the bottom of the view. Before, our constraints were red, and that was indicating to us that we were missing some constraints. Now they're not red anymore, but we have this yellow outline and yellow dotted outline. And this is Interface Builder that's telling us that the frame of the button and the constraints are different. And actually, if we go down here and look and update the frames of this button, you can see that it sizes it down to the size of that dotted outline that we had before. By default, Auto Layout will create some constraints for you for controls for views like button or a label that fit the size of the content of it. So it's sizing this button to be just big enough to fit the text button that we have in the button itself. We'll talk about intrinsic content size a little bit later in a later video, but for now we're just going to undo this. Let's create a constraint for the second button. We'll create a constraint from the button to its trailing space to container margin. Whenever I'm creating a layout, I think about what might change about that layout. In this case, even if the buttons don't stay on the bottom margin, they're probably going to stay lined up to each other. So even though I could create a constraint from this button to the bottom margin, just like I did for the first one, a better practice would be for me to create a constraint between this button and the first button. That way, if I want to move this set of buttons, I can just move one constraint or edit one constraint and both of the buttons will move together. It's probably not that big of a deal when you only have two buttons, but if we had a whole row of buttons or views, it's a lot easier to move them together if you create constraints for one view and then create constraints between that view and the other views that will align up with it. So I control drag from the right button to the left button, and now I want to create several constraints between these. Before, when we just clicked on one of these options, the menu goes away and it creates the constraint that we selected. If we wanted to create multiple constraints, you can hold down the Shift key, and we want to create this horizontal spacing constraint, and we want to align the bottoms of these two. You can see that when I'm holding down the Shift key and I click on these, that it puts a check mark next to the new ones that it's creating. And it used to be that if I would click away from this, that it would just create the constraints for me. New in the latest versions of Xcode, you have to click on Add Constraints for it to add both of these for you. So we've added a horizontal spacing constraint, and we've aligned the bottoms, and we've pinned both of these bottom buttons to the sides. We just need one more constraint between these, and we want them to be an equal width. When I control drag from one view to the other, and there are already constraints between those two views, it'll show those constraints with a dot. And the new constraints that I'm creating, it'll use a check mark for those. So let's add the equal widths constraint to these. So we've created all the constraints that we want to create on this, and Interface Builder is still warning us that these frames are different from the constraints that we have defined. The reason is that when we dragged these out and we made them approximately equal width, we didn't get them exact. But the constraints define exactly what the frame should be. And so we know that the constraints are right, and we just want to update the frames to match those constraints that we have created. With this button selected, if I click on this Resolve Auto Layout Issues button, and I select to update the frames, what this is going to do is the frames and the constraints are currently different. It's going to update the frames to match the constraints that I have defined. And that'll do that for that one button. But the option that I want in this case, I'm going to go ahead and undo this, is I want to do that for all the views in my container. So I'm going to go back to this, and in this bottom section, I'm going to choose Update Frames for all views in the view controller. And now you can see all our warnings are gone. Let's look at this in the Preview Assistant Editor again. And here we have the iPhone 4-inch. And now you can see the buttons have the standard spacing to the sides like we defined, and the standard spacing between them. They're equal width, and they're pinned to the bottom. And also in the 5.5-inch form factor, they're also pinned to the bottom and equal spacing between them in equal size, exactly like we wanted. I'm going to select both of these using Command Click, and we're going to look at all the constraints that we have defined. And remember, in Auto Layout, you want to fully define the X and Y position and width and height of every control. And we've done that here. And we didn't create an explicit width constraint on either of these, but we've given it enough information to determine what the width should be. If you look at the full width of the view, we've created a leading space constraint on the left button. We've created a space constraint between the buttons, and we created a trailing space constraint on the right button. If you take that out of the full width and then you make these two buttons being equal width, we added this equal width constraint, it knows exactly what width it needs to make both of these buttons in order to make them equal and to keep those space constraints. So we have the width defined. The leading space constraint defines the X position for this button. That, along with the width, and this space constraint defines the X position for this button. And then in the Y direction, the height is determined by the intrinsic content size that we mentioned. It's just high enough to display the content of the button. And the Y position is a standard space from the bottom of the view minus that intrinsic content size height. So it knows both of the height and the Y position from the bottom constraint. So there you have it, our first look at creating some constraints. Well, that's all for this video tutorial. As always, we'd like to leave you with a challenge. Your first challenge is to create a new project and build this layout. Make sure it looks right in landscape and portrait on multiple screen sizes. That is the point after all. If you have any questions, check out the challenge document. And if you get stuck, I've included a walkthrough in the challenge document as well. And of course, if you have any questions about the tutorial or the challenge, feel free to leave a comment below. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.